Hello geographers, and welcome to this video, which is your very last one as you finish the topic of physical landscapes in the UK. So what you're going to be looking at through this video is your flood management example. So if you remember at the end of coast, you looked at Lyme Regis as an example of a place that is managing the coastline really well. And what we're doing today is we're going to the northwest of our country to a town called Cockermouth in Cumbria, where they have had an unfortunate history of flooding in the last decade or so, and therefore put quite a lot of thought into their flood management. So before we start, I think I need to address the name, because as we teach this in lesson, we always have to explain why such a place would be given such a strange name. And actually the name is linked to the river. So just so that you're aware of this, because it is actually quite relevant when we're looking at the management of the area. There are two rivers that flow through this town, and the first one, where it got its name from, is the River Cocker. So that is a river that comes from Cockermouth, which is a lake within the Lake District. If any of you have been on holiday in the Lake District, you'll know there are quite a lot of these ribbon lakes. And then what we've also got is we've got the River Derwent, which goes through Cockermouth as well. Now the River Derwent is bigger. So that means that where Cockermouth lies is the mouth of the River Cocker, because we have the river finishing there. So the smaller River Cocker basically ends at the River Derwent. All the water from that smaller river joins the River Derwent and then carries on westwards towards the coastline. So ultimately, it's just the name of the river and the fact that the town is existing upon the mouth. And that's why you get places such as Weymouth being named in a similar sort of way, because they exist at the mouth, for example, of the River Wey. So with all of that in context, what we also need to make sure we're able to do is locate this town within the UK, as well as understanding that local reasoning behind the name. So what you should find in your booklet now is you should find an area where you can write a couple of sentences down to describe the location of our case study. So what I'm going to do, because you are working remotely today, is I am going to give you the option to have a bit of a structure to help you out. But if you feel that you are able to do that now already, then challenge yourself. Pause the video now and give this a go. How would you describe where Cockermouth is within the UK? You can use the map that we've got here for you. You can go onto Google Earth, whatever it is that you would like to do to help you do that. With this challenge of not having any structure, then go for it. If, however, you would like a little bit of structure, what I'm now going to do is give you some sentences that you just need to fill in the gaps of, and all three of these can be going into your box in your worksheet. Again, if it's something that you want to make sure you're getting right from the very start and you want even more structure, you can not pause this video now and just wait for my words to pop up at the bottom. So here we go. This is the most structured way in which you are going to be doing this today. So hopefully, if you haven't already done, you are now going to pause this video and just write your description of your case study location now. Unpause once you're ready to check those answers. Off you go. Okay, so let's go through these. So first of all, let's start with the one that's at the top right. So Cockermouth is positioned in the northwest of England on the northern border of the Lake District National Park. You should have been able to spot that by the green colour on that map on the left. Looking below that map, we've got the next bit. So it is to the east of the town of Workington and the north of Cockermouth Lake. As we said, that is actually the source of this river. And the final one is that the town sits at the confluence of the River Cocker and the River Derwent. So hopefully now you've got a bit of that previous slide's information there within your description of this location as well. Okay, so what we now need to do is just think about why we've chosen this town. Why is it that this particular town has got some quite well-known flood management strategies upon its river? So we have to go as far back as 2009 to understand why all of this was necessary. But as well as that being a particularly bad series of rainfall, they had record-breaking rainfall that caused these incredible floods. It's definitely worth knowing that this is generally a very wet part of our country due to the fact it's close to those mountains, and therefore that they have experienced flooding since. But it was those 2009 floods that made the area realise they needed to do something about their river in order to be able to live next to it. So what I'd like you to do now is pause this video and find video link 1 that is in the description box. You don't need to watch all of it, but I'd like you to watch at least the first 2 or 3 minutes just to get a bit of a feel as to what happened in this area during those 2009 floods. And then once you have done that, you can come back to me and we'll start looking at some facts and figures. Okay, so hopefully that just gives you a little bit of a visual on why this area needed protection. But we're actually going to take a step back now and think, how on earth did it get that bad? So you heard about the information I just gave you about the heavy rainfall, but the location actually means that flooding is going to actually potentially be quite bad for lots of reasons. So what I'd like you to do now is have a little bit of a look again at your work booklet, and you'll see that you've got this diagram here. Now what I'd like you to do is think about why this area is so vulnerable to flooding, and these pictures here are designed to be prompts. So pause this video now, have a little bit of a think about what each of these photographs might be trying to hint at, and of course you can write your ideas at this point as well. But once you've had a bit of a think by yourself, then unpause this video again and come back to me. So off you go, pause now, and then we'll speak when you're ready to go through it together. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go bit by bit and go through each of these and explain them. What your job is going to be whilst I'm doing this is to just make almost a spider diagram of notes around this image in your work booklet. So the first one is thinking about steep slopes with very little vegetation. So our knowledge of the water cycle already tells us that steep slopes without the vegetation to hold on to the water as it falls onto those steep slopes means that you're going to have water flowing downhill as surface runoff really, really quickly. And unfortunately, as you can see here, these orange mountainous regions are surrounding Cockermouth and effectively allowing that water to channel downhill pretty quickly. So the first thing is its proximity to those steep slopes and those Lake District mountains. Another thing which you may or may not have spotted because it was quite small writing is that this is all to do with rock type, this one on the right hand side. And as we've spoken about in previous lessons, anywhere that is very volcanic or has been very volcanic, like the Lake District was historically, tends to have very impermeable rock. And we know as geographers, knowing that water cycle, that again, if you don't have that ability for that water to soak into the ground and infiltrate into the ground, then you're going to get that surface runoff and all of that water will end up in the river very quickly. Okay, so as I mentioned, rainfall is very much a thing in the Lake District. Again, anybody that's been on holiday will know that it tends to be quite wet there, even in the summer. And there's lots of reasons for that, but one of the reasons is also that the southwest winds bring quite heavy rainfall into this part of our country. We could say that that is actually very much the case still in our southwest, but a lot of our water comes from the Atlantic. So because this area is also positioned on the western border, at the western coastline, then we are also going to be looking at quite heavy rainfall. Okay, so this next one here is all to do with lots of water meeting at the same time. So as I told you in that previous slide, we've got two rivers joining literally right in the middle of this town. So the River Derwent, as I said, is the larger river, and the River Cocker, they both join really close to the middle of town. And what that means is that you've got lots of water hitting this place all at once, and that is just going to give this river the potential to spill its banks a little bit more than if it had just been one river flowing with all of those other problems already mixed in. And the final thing we need to appreciate is that this is an urban area. So it's not the biggest city in the world. It's not even considered really a very large town. But the fact is that the area around the river is concrete and tarmac, and therefore any water that falls into this area is not going to be able to infiltrate through the ground. It's just going to, again, flow through those streets and end up in the river itself. So this guide, I suppose, to the vulnerability of flooding in Cockermouth is actually only really scratching the surface as to some of the reasons why this area is very prone to flooding. But you should make sure that you feel confident with at least explaining 3 of these to talk about how these factors will lead to lots of water being in the river, and also that water getting there very quickly, remembering about that lag time on a hydrograph that we've looked at in previous lessons. Okay, so now we've got that background, we need to think about what is actually being done on this river and within this town. So this is a part of the UK, as with many others, that is managed by the Environment Agency. And they've created 2 videos that show you the defence scheme running through Cockermouth along the river. So the first one is quite a comical one. So you're looking at a duck who takes a little bit of a journey down the river to show you all of the different things that are being used to protect the town, and it's done in a very, very comical Cumbrian accent as well, so you'll hopefully be able to bear with that. But actually everything that he's showing you is really valid, so it's definitely worth a look at that one. And then you've also got a second one, which is obviously a little bit more serious. Again, they're both by the Environment Agency, but it does tell you a little bit more about those strategies. Now, whilst you're watching these 2 videos, which are video link 2 and 3 in the description box, you are going to be also filling in your fact file. So in your booklet, you'll notice that you've got a fact file with some numbers, some words missing, and your job is just going to be to hopefully fill in those gaps as you're watching these videos. So give this a go now, and then once you're ready, come back to me and we'll look at that fact file in a completed form together. Okay, so here we have all of the defences that you should have seen in those videos, and there's lots of things here that you can just be checking in terms of making sure you've got all of those words and numbers right. So before I go through this, I'd maybe even recommend now that you pause this video, you use this as a way to check your answers or fill in any gaps of anything that you weren't quite able to take from those videos, and then we'll talk about these things separately once you're done. So pause the video, use this to check your answers, and then come back to me. Okay, so there are a few things here which don't need a lot of explanation, but obviously taking note of the cost and the potential positive impact of 360 homes and 55 businesses being protected. But there are a couple of things that I do need to talk about with you. Some of these I will do using this slide, and then I've got some photographs to show you as well. So the first thing to just be aware of is this level of protection thing. So the flood defences that were put into this town were built to deal with a 1 in 100 year flood. What that means is that every 100 years you tend to get a flood that is pretty bad, and those are the ones that are hopefully going to be withstood using these flood defences. If you'd have got something, a flood defence that was to deal with a 1 in 5 year flood, for example, that probably wouldn't really be as effective or even as expensive, because a 1 in 5 year flood tends not to be as bad as the ones that happen every 100 years. So a couple of things that are worth noting here are things like flood windows. So making sure that any windows that run alongside the river are really well structured so that they don't break and shatter even if water should actually rise to the point at which they come into contact with the force of the river. We've got lots of other things as well in terms of glass panels and reinforced concrete walls, but I've got some photographs that I think I'm going to show you to just go through those together with you now. Okay, so let's have a look at these photographs one by one, and I've also put a little reminder almost to myself at the bottom here to talk about what's good and bad about them, because I think it's a really good thing to be aware of, as well as just what these things are. So the first two photographs, so we've got this one here and we've also got this larger gate here. These are both very sturdy gates that can be closed if the flood water does start to rise. Now, it's really important that we don't forget about our bridges if there is a flood upon a river, because there's no point building a fantastic flood wall or embankment all along the river and then leaving your bridges open, because if that water does manage to get up to the level of the bridge, then it's just going to spill in through that weak area. So having these really sturdy floodgates that you can shut, so these are ones that are closed by people. There's a reason why I'm saying that, which I'll talk about in a minute. Then that does mean that you're not allowing that water to spill in anywhere, and it makes your flood walls secure, fully secure. Now, a disadvantage of this is, of course, a lot of the time they don't look very nice, but also you do have to remember to close them. And if you've got a flood happening during the night, for example, or you don't have the person that's got the key or the ability to close it, then actually that can sometimes cause a delay, which unfortunately means that these are going to be rendered pretty useless. Another thing that we've got in Cockermouth is this self-closing barrier. So as you can see here along this wall, you've got your typical flood wall, and then on top of that, we've got this kind of grey structure. Now that grey structure isn't always there. And it will actually close or kind of pull itself up all by itself. So there's a reason as to why they've done this. They haven't made the wall really, really high because they didn't want these people in these homes to be looking at a brick wall. It's an area that relies on tourism. So actually having a brick wall that doesn't allow people to look over the river could actually be a huge disadvantage. So this is a very clever system that has a sensor that waits for that water to start rising, and then without any human intervention, this barrier will close all by itself. So it is really clever because you don't have to employ somebody to be monitoring the river. You don't need to be employing somebody to be on call to come out and raise this barrier up. So it is a really, really effective way of making sure that a barrier doesn't cause negative visual implications, but it does work without relying on human interaction if the area should flood. So as you can see there, just imagining that body of water that can actually be held by that barrier is quite something. It makes a huge difference, just that extra few centimetres. There's something else that's been happening along the River Cocker and the River Derwent in particular is dredging. So this is one of the flood management schemes that is a little bit controversial because it involves making the river wider and deeper by scouring out the riverbed and banks. Now, of course, what that means is that the river will be able to hold on to loads more water, so it's less likely to flood, and therefore it can be very effective. The obvious negative there is environmental. If you are scouring up the beds and the banks of a river, then they tend to be areas where you've had fish spawning and you've got lots of other really important ecosystem functions that exist on those parts of the river. So it's a very controversial thing that organisations such as Greenpeace really don't like. But as you can see here, there's obviously been the justification for it. So just being aware of those advantages and disadvantages, because there will be parts of certain rivers where this would not be possible if, for example, there is a particularly important species living within it. Okay, and then having a little bit of a look at this one. So this is, for the same sort of reason, a wall that has not been made taller, by brick because we need to hold on to that tourism and the aesthetic look of the town. But instead of having that self-closing barrier, here you can see there is reinforced glass. So again, what that means is that river can actually rise up far, far higher than if it was just that original brick wall, yet it's not going to be destroying the view of the area. You can imagine how that would feel very, very different as you were walking down there if you were only looking at a brick wall and couldn't look out onto that river. And another thing that's worth mentioning is that floodplain zoning is very much a part of the planning within Cockermouth. So as you can see here in this Environment Agency map, we've got the main rivers. So you can see we've got the River Cocker here with a few tributaries, and we've got the main River Derwent running through this area. Now, what you can see around it are areas that are at risk of flooding. So these areas here, the kind of minty coloured green is showing the more extreme flooding risk areas, and then the kind of typical floods are going to be in the kind of darker blue. So there are some exceptions to places that were maybe built before these sorts of maps were drawn, but you can definitely see that most of this area has not been built on. So there are significant restrictions in what you can build around the river, particularly to kind of the west of the hospital here, because they find that this is the area that does flood the most and the most frequently. So of course, when we think about disadvantages of floodplain zoning, it doesn't stop the flooding. Unfortunately, we can't just pick up and move buildings that are already in these areas, but it does allow us to make good planning decisions for the future. Okay, so what I would like you to do as a final video watch is I'd like you to actually now pause and go and watch video link 4 in this description box to bring your case study knowledge up to date a little bit, because the 2009 flood was not the last one. We also had a significant level of flooding in the area during Storm Desmond in 2015. So go and have a little bit of a watch of that video for me and then come back to me once you're done. But ultimately, I think the question needs to be, has all of this flood management worked? Has it actually prevented flooding from happening in 2015? So go and have a watch after pausing my video and come back to me once you've watched that 4th video link. Okay, so hopefully what you did spot is, unfortunately, this flood management strategy was not as successful as the area of Cockermouth would have perhaps liked, but thankfully it did play a part in reducing the impact of Storm Desmond. So we just need to be aware of the realistic expectations of some of these management strategies that we're using. Okay, so we're going to finish today's lesson just by making sure that we've got a good range of social, economic and environmental issues associated with this case study. Now, I say issues, some of these are actually positives. So the main thing that you're doing here is just practicing that classification of social, anything to do with people, economic, anything to do with money, and environmental, anything to do with the natural environment. And then you are hopefully going to come back to me so that you can go through some answers. So for ease, if possible, it'd be great if you could stay similar to my colours along the bottom, but you absolutely don't have to. It will just mean that when you're looking at this and the answers with me later, it will be easier for you to follow them. So pause this video now and then classify these things into social, economic, environmental, and come back to me once you are all done. Okay, so I think what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to show all of these as a full set of answers. So if you would like to, you can pause this now and just check your answers and check that they kind of go alongside these. But if you're happy to do that whilst I'm talking, I'm just going to run through a couple of things that we haven't spoken about yet. So the first one, or the first classification, is the social issues, or the social factors, perhaps might have been a better way to write that. So the first thing to note is that, as I said, this area is particularly important for tourism. It's just to the north of the Lake District. So the flood walls have actually been designed to blend in with the Georgian Georgian character of the town. It hasn't really caused too much of an eyesore upon an area that does really depend on looking quite pretty. However, there have been some social issues. So you can see directly underneath that, the scheme wasn't finished until 2013. So it took 4 years for this flood scheme to actually be finished, which of course caused disruption during the time in which it was being constructed. We had big lorries coming in, bringing everything in, lots of road closures, and that does play a part socially upon these sorts of things. There are some arguments that not everything was in keeping with the Georgian character of the town. So things like the new bridges potentially aren't the prettiest things in the world, but they are more secure. And of course, they can close up, which, as we discussed, is really important. Probably the big social benefit is the feeling of safety. And a lot of businesses have felt so safe that they have come back to the area after being completely washed out in that 2009 flood. And of course, that has knock-on impacts for the economy as well, doesn't it? We need those businesses to exist in this small town. Okay, so we're looking at my red now and we're thinking about economic. So obviously the price was a big one. £4.4 million is quite a lot of money to spend on a small town. So it actually works out that on average, it's £11,000 for each property that was protected. Obviously not expecting the properties to pay that. Council taxes had to go up. It was also funded by donations, but that money did have to come from somewhere. So unfortunately, that did have an impact upon the greater community around Cockermouth. That being said, though, because all of this is in place, people's home insurance went down. So you're not paying the premium of living in a risky area anymore, and that will have a longer positive knock-on impact on people's finances. As I said, the self-closing barrier has no operational costs because there's no people required to operate it. And of course, all of this is reducing economic damage. So in the long term, like I said, those positives probably outweigh that initial increase in council tax. And the very last thing to consider is the environment. So if we have a look at all of these things, the area situated by the River Cocker is actually a SSSI, which stands for a site of special scientific interest, which is one of the reasons why the River Cocker didn't get as much of that dredging as the River Derwent did. It was protected as a result of that. But there we see to the right of that statement that dredging did still happen, and it did inevitably have an impact upon the wildlife and biodiversity of the River Derwent. And the final thing to note here is that actually environmentally, extreme weather is set to get worse, isn't it? So unfortunately, the 2015 storm Desmond is probably not the last flood to overtop these defences. We have to be ready for a changing, increasing level of extreme weather in the UK. And therefore, unfortunately, we are going to have to start thinking differently about how we are protecting our small towns. So with all of that done, hopefully that is the end of where we need to be for today, and that also marks the end of your topic. So congratulations for finishing not just rivers but also coasts.